In the spring of 1940, a Japanese naval officer sat alone in his cabin aboard the flagship Nagato, contemplating an audacious plan that would seal his nation's fate. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had conceived the idea himself. No one had ordered him to plan an attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The idea came from his own strategic mind, born of his understanding that if war with America came, Japan's only chance lay in a devastating first strike. The man who would design the most shocking surprise attack in modern naval history was also the man who understood better than anyone in Japan why it would ultimately fail. Yamamoto had spent years in America. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, officially enrolled as a special student of English, but dedicating much of his time to understanding the petroleum industry that fueled American power. During summer vacations, he hitchhiked across the country, visiting oil fields in Texas to see American industrial might firsthand. He was a keen observer of American culture. His classmates at Harvard remembered him as a hard worker, but not a grind, exceptionally curious and imaginative. When they introduced him to poker, he became obsessive about the game, staying up entire nights to master it. He studied the mathematics of probability, the psychology of bluffing, the art of reading opponents. Those poker games taught him something about Americans that his fellow Japanese officers never learned. Americans were not reckless. They were calculating. They played the long game. They accepted short-term losses to set up winning positions. And when they held winning hands, they pressed their advantage without mercy. Later, as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, Yamamoto traveled extensively throughout the United States. He visited automobile factories in Detroit and watched assembly lines produce cars at rates that seemed impossible. He toured steel mills in Pittsburgh and oil refineries in Texas. He calculated tonnages and production rates and drew conclusions that terrified him. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas, Yamamoto later said, knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. He also played poker with American naval officers during his Washington posting. He won consistently, developing what he later called contempt for the mental agility of his American opponents at the card table. But he never made the mistake of confusing card-playing skill with national character. Yamamoto knew something his fellow Japanese military leaders refused to accept. America was not soft. America was not weak. And America would not negotiate peace after a single devastating blow. When asked by Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe about the prospects of war with the United States, Yamamoto gave an answer that would prove prophetic. He said that if ordered to fight, he could run wild for the first 6 months and win victory upon victory. But he had no expectation of success if the war continued beyond that. 6 months. That was all Yamamoto believed Japan had. After that, he foresaw only defeat. The Battle of Midway, the engagement that shattered Japanese naval power and turned the tide of the Pacific War, occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had predicted his own failure with terrifying precision, yet Japan attacked anyway. This is the story of how an entire nation convinced itself that Americans were too soft, too divided, and too unwilling to sacrifice for victory. It is the story of how racial stereotypes, cultural arrogance, and wishful thinking led Japanese leaders to fundamentally misread the nation they were about to awaken. And it is the story of how that miscalculation cost Japan everything. The roots of Japan's fatal misjudgment stretched back decades before Pearl Harbor to a victory that convinced Japanese military planners they understood how to defeat a larger power. In 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, beginning the Russo-Japanese War. The parallels to Pearl Harbor were striking: a sudden strike without a formal declaration of war, a devastating blow against an enemy fleet caught at anchor, the destruction of naval power before the enemy could mobilize, and it worked. Over the following year, Japan defeated Russia in battle after battle. On land, Japanese forces captured Port Arthur after a grueling siege that cost both sides dearly. At Mukden, in the longest land battle of modern history to that point, Japanese troops outflanked the Russian army and captured the city. The climax came at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, when Admiral Togo Heihachiro annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. The Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron had sailed over 7 months and 18,000 nautical miles from the Baltic Sea to reach Asian waters. They arrived exhausted, poorly supplied, and already demoralized by news that Port Arthur had fallen. Togo positioned his fleet to cross the T of the Russian formation, a classic naval maneuver that allowed all Japanese guns to bear, while only the leading Russian ships could respond. The result was annihilation. Russia lost all 11 of its battleships, 7 sunk and 4 captured, along with numerous smaller vessels and over 5,000 men killed or captured. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats and 117 sailors. The Russian admiral, Zinovy Rozhestvensky, was captured by the Japanese. The victorious Admiral Togo visited him in hospital wearing civilian clothes and offered words of comfort. Defeat, Togo said, was a common fate of soldiers. There was nothing to be ashamed of. The important thing was whether they had performed their duty. This moment of chivalry obscured a harder truth. Japan had won not because of superior courage or spiritual strength, but because of superior positioning, better intelligence, and an enemy weakened by a 7-month voyage. It was the most decisive naval victory since Trafalgar. More importantly, it was the first time in modern history that a non-Western nation had defeated a major European power in war. The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by President Theodore Roosevelt, ended the conflict. Japan gained control of Korea, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Russia, humiliated and racked by internal revolution, accepted terms. Japanese military planners drew a lesson from this victory that would haunt them for decades. They concluded that a surprise attack against enemy naval forces, followed by rapid military success, could force a larger power to negotiate, rather than fight, a prolonged war. The lesson was wrong. Russia had been weakened by internal unrest, stretched thin across 2 continents, and fighting 12,000 miles from its industrial heartland. Japan's victory owed as much to Russian weakness as Japanese strength, but the Japanese remembered only the triumph. Tsushima became the template for dealing with superior enemies. Strike first, strike hard, and the enemy will negotiate. They would try the same strategy against America. It would not work. Japan's miscalculation about American willpower grew from something deeper than strategic analysis. It grew from contempt. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese military leaders watched the Western democracies with disdain. They saw weakness everywhere. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Germany remilitarized the Rhineland and absorbed Austria. Japan itself invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale war against China in 1937. The Western powers protested. They condemned. They imposed ineffective sanctions, but they did not fight. Japanese leaders concluded that democracies lacked the stomach for war. They believed that nations which valued individual rights and personal comfort could not match the sacrificial spirit of Japan, where duty to the emperor transcended all personal concerns. The Japanese military was convinced of the willingness of its own people to make any sacrifice for their nation. They were equally contemptuous of what they saw as the softness of American and European democracies, where loyalty and patriotism were tempered by concern for individual rights and well-being. This contempt was reinforced by racial thinking that pervaded Japanese military culture. Many Japanese officers believed that Americans were fundamentally inferior warriors, too attached to luxury and comfort to endure the hardships of prolonged conflict. They pointed to America's isolationist politics, its divided public opinion about involvement in foreign wars, and its apparent reluctance to fight as evidence of national weakness. One Japanese military assessment from 1941 concluded that the American people loved luxury, that their culture was shallow and meaningless, and that they lacked the spiritual strength for sustained warfare. It was a catastrophic misreading of American character. Yamamoto, who had actually lived among Americans, tried to correct this delusion. He gave a speech in which he warned that most people thought Americans loved luxury and were weak, but this was a mistake. The Americans, he said, would respond to attack with determination and fury. Nobody listened. There was one more calculation that Japanese leaders made before Pearl Harbor. They believed that even if America fought back, its industrial capacity would take years to mobilize. Japan would have time to consolidate its conquests, establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and force America to accept a negotiated settlement rather than fight a long war to reclaim distant islands. This, too, was wrong. Japan's military planners knew, in the abstract, that America possessed enormous industrial potential. Internal Imperial Navy studies conducted in 1941 showed exactly the trends in American shipbuilding that would eventually overwhelm Japan. They understood the numbers, but they convinced themselves that democracy made this potential irrelevant. They believed that American workers would not accept the sacrifices of wartime production, that labor disputes would paralyze factories, that a divided Congress would obstruct mobilization, and that the American public would demand peace rather than endure years of rationing and casualties. They were gambling that Americans would choose comfort over victory. In 1939, American aircraft production for the military was less than 3,000 planes annually. Adolf Hitler was told by his advisors that President Roosevelt's calls for 50,000 aircraft per year were propaganda, impossible to achieve. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly 100,000 aircraft per year. The United States built more planes in 1944 alone than Japan produced during the entire war. Japanese planners had correctly identified American industrial potential. They simply refused to believe that a democratic society could actually harness it. On July 26, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed suit within days. The immediate trigger was Japan's occupation of French Indochina on July 24. With France under German occupation, the Vichy government had agreed to Japanese military bases in the colony. Japanese forces quickly occupied Cam Ranh Naval Base, positioned just 800 miles from the Philippines where Americans had troops, and threatened the British base at Singapore. Roosevelt's response was swift and severe. The asset freeze did not merely restrict trade, it effectively ended all commercial relations between Japan and the United States. Japanese bank accounts were frozen. Japanese ships in American ports could not load cargo. Contracts were voided. Trade that had flowed for decades stopped overnight. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed the American lead. The combined effect was catastrophic for Japan. The nation lost access to 3/4 of its overseas trade and 88% of its imported oil. The numbers were stark. Japan imported most of its oil from the United States. Without American oil, Japan's reserves could sustain normal operations for perhaps 3 years. Under wartime conditions, with ships and aircraft consuming fuel at accelerated rates, that estimate dropped to 18 months or less. The Japanese Navy informed Emperor Hirohito that oil reserves would be exhausted within 2 years if new sources were not found. Army planners calculated that their mechanized divisions would be immobilized even sooner. Japan's military planners confronted a terrible choice. They could accept American demands to withdraw from China and abandon their imperial ambitions, or they could go to war to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the resources of Southeast Asia. For the militarists who dominated the Japanese government, withdrawal from China was unthinkable. It would mean admitting that 4 years of war and hundreds of thousands of casualties had been wasted. It would mean political humiliation and probably the fall of the government. They chose war instead. The military presented war not as a choice but as a necessity. Japan was being strangled. The alternative to war was slow economic death and the abandonment of everything Japan had fought for. What they did not present was an honest assessment of what victory actually required. Admiral Yamamoto understood what victory against America would truly demand. In a letter meant to warn against war, he wrote that it would not be enough to take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, Japan would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. He wondered aloud whether Japan's politicians had confidence as to the final outcome. His words were meant as a stark warning about the impossibility of true victory. Japanese militarists later truncated the quote to make it sound like a boast. He was not being rhetorical. He was stating a strategic truth. America was not Russia. It could not be knocked out of the war by naval defeats in distant waters. Its industrial heartland was protected by 2 oceans. Its population was enormous. Its resources were virtually unlimited. Yamamoto knew this because he had seen it. He had toured American oil fields and automobile factories. He had watched the assembly lines and counted the oil derricks. He understood that any war with America that lasted more than a year or two would end in Japanese defeat, regardless of how brilliantly Japanese forces fought. Yet Yamamoto also understood that his country had made its choice. His warning to Prime Minister Konoe had gone unheeded. Japan would fight, and Yamamoto would do his duty, knowing all the while that time was against them. He designed Pearl Harbor not to win the war, but to buy time. If Japan could destroy the American Pacific Fleet and establish a defensive perimeter before American industrial power could mobilize, perhaps America would choose to negotiate, rather than fight a long war to reclaim distant Pacific islands. It was a desperate gamble. Yamamoto knew it. But his superiors refused to listen to his warnings about what would happen if the gamble failed. At 7:55, on the morning of December 7, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the attack force from a position at the head of the first wave. As his aircraft approached Oahu, he saw no American fighters rising to intercept, no anti-aircraft fire reaching up to meet them, no sign that the Americans expected an attack. He transmitted the code phrase, "Tora, Tora, Tora," meaning tiger, 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 to signal that complete surprise had been achieved. Over the next 2 hours, 353 aircraft from 6 Japanese carriers attacked the American Pacific Fleet at anchor. They came in 2 waves, the first at 7:55 and the second at 8:50. Torpedo planes skimmed low over the water to drop their weapons against the battleships moored along Ford Island. Dive bombers screamed down from altitude to plant bombs on decks and hangars. Horizontal bombers released their loads from high altitude. Fighters strafed anything that moved. The primary targets were Battleship Row, where the Pacific Fleet's most powerful vessels were moored in neat lines along the southeast shore of Ford Island. Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, the main Army air bases, were hit to prevent American aircraft from responding. Ford Island Naval Air Station was attacked to destroy patrol planes that might track the Japanese carriers as they withdrew. The devastation was severe. The battleship Arizona was struck by multiple bombs in the opening minutes of the attack. One armor-piercing bomb, a modified 16-inch naval shell, penetrated the deck near Turret 2 and detonated in the forward magazine, where over 1 million pounds of gunpowder was stored. The explosion was catastrophic. A fireball erupted from the Arizona that was visible for miles. The forward section of the ship was completely destroyed. The vessel settled to the bottom of the harbor in less than 9 minutes. 1,177 of her crew were killed, nearly half of all American deaths that day. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg both died at their posts, directing the defense of their ship under fire until the magazine exploded. The Oklahoma capsized after being hit by multiple torpedoes on her port side. She rolled over completely, trapping hundreds of sailors below decks. Rescue workers could hear men tapping on the hull for days after the attack, but most could not be reached in time. 429 men died aboard the Oklahoma. The California, West Virginia, Nevada, and other battleships were sunk or severely damaged. The West Virginia settled upright on the harbor bottom after taking 7 torpedo hits and 2 bomb hits. The California sank slowly over the course of 3 days despite desperate efforts to save her. The Nevada actually got underway during the attack and attempted to leave the harbor, but was ordered to beach herself rather than risk sinking in the channel and blocking the port. By the time the last Japanese aircraft withdrew shortly after 9:30, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Nearly 20 ships had been sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft had been destroyed, most of them on the ground before they could even attempt to resist. The Japanese pilots returned to their carriers in triumph. They had achieved complete surprise. They had inflicted massive casualties with minimal losses, only 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. The operation had succeeded beyond all expectations, but they had made a critical error. The American aircraft carriers, the most important vessels in the fleet, were not in port that day. Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego undergoing repairs. The Japanese had sunk battleships, relics of an earlier era of naval warfare, but the carriers that would win the Pacific War escaped untouched. The Japanese attackers had also failed to destroy critical infrastructure. The fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to keep the Pacific Fleet operating for months. A determined attack on these tanks would have crippled American operations far more effectively than sinking battleships. The dry docks and repair facilities were also largely intact. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, chose not to launch a third strike. His pilots had accomplished their primary mission. The element of surprise was gone. American defenders were now alert and fighting back fiercely. Nagumo worried about the location of the American carriers and did not want to risk his precious fleet carriers to potential counterattack. He withdrew, leaving behind a devastated harbor, but also an untouched industrial base, intact fuel supplies, and the carriers that would soon begin to strike back. And there was something else the Japanese had not destroyed. Something that would prove far more important than any ship. They had not destroyed American resolve. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was intended to shatter American morale and convince the American public that war with Japan would be too costly to pursue. It achieved the exact opposite. Before December 7th, American public opinion about the war had been deeply divided. While most Americans sympathized with the Allies, they had no desire to send their sons to fight in foreign conflicts. Isolationist sentiment was powerful. Polls showed that despite growing support for Britain, the overwhelming majority of Americans opposed direct military involvement. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified the nation overnight. Within 24 hours of President Roosevelt's address to Congress, in which he declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy, the Senate voted unanimously for war, 82-0. The House of Representatives followed with a vote of 388-1, with pacifist Jeanette Rankin of Montana casting the only dissenting vote. The America First Committee, the most powerful isolationist organization in the country, dissolved itself within days. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans debated whether the war was their concern. After Pearl Harbor, 16 million Americans served in uniform. Japanese planners had expected that the shock of Pearl Harbor would discourage American resistance. Instead, it created a fury that would not be satisfied until Japan surrendered unconditionally. Remember, Pearl Harbor became the rallying cry of a nation. Every American knew someone who had died in the attack, knew someone who had enlisted to avenge it, or would soon join the fight themselves. The sneak attack, delivered before a formal declaration of war, convinced Americans that Japan was not merely an enemy but a treacherous one that had to be thoroughly defeated. The Japanese had awakened exactly what Yamamoto feared. They had united a divided nation and filled it with terrible resolve. The first evidence that Japan had miscalculated came just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, from the least expected direction. On April 18, 1942, 16B-25, Mitchell bombers lifted off from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet, 650 miles from the Japanese coast. It was the first time medium bombers had ever launched from an aircraft carrier, and the pilots had no expectation of returning to the ship. Their plan was to bomb Japan and then fly on to airfields in China. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led the raid. He was 45 years old, a former racing pilot and aviation pioneer who had set speed records and earned a doctorate in aeronautics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. When asked to plan a strike on Japan, he volunteered to lead it personally. The raiders trained in secret for weeks, practicing short takeoffs that simulated carrier deck launches. Each crew consisted of 5 men. Each aircraft carried 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high explosive, and 1 incendiary. The targets were military and industrial facilities in Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The mission nearly failed before it began. Early on the morning of April 18, a Japanese patrol boat spotted the American task force and radioed a contact report before being sunk. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the carrier force, faced a difficult decision. The original plan called for launching the bombers at dusk, 400 miles from Japan, allowing them to arrive over their targets at night and reach China in daylight. But with Japanese forces now alerted, every hour of delay increased the risk that the carriers would be attacked. Halsey ordered Doolittle to launch immediately, 200 miles farther from Japan than planned and in broad daylight. Doolittle's B-25 was first off the deck at 8:20 in the morning. The other 15 aircraft followed over the next hour, each crew knowing that the early launch meant they would not have enough fuel to reach their planned landing sites in China. They would have to ditch in the ocean, bail out over Japanese-occupied territory, or hope to reach Chinese lines before their tanks ran dry. All 16 aircraft reached Japan and struck their targets. Doolittle himself bombed an aircraft factory in Tokyo. Other crews hit steel mills, oil tank farms, and military installations. Anti-aircraft fire was scattered. Japanese fighters were slow to respond, having expected any attack to come from carriers much closer to the coast. The physical damage was minimal. Preliminary Japanese reports stated 12 killed and more than 100 wounded. A handful of buildings were destroyed. One bomber slightly damaged the light carrier Ryuho at Yokosuka, delaying her completion. In terms of military impact, the raid was insignificant, but the psychological impact was enormous. The Japanese military had assured the public that the home islands were invulnerable to attack. The emperor's person was sacred, and his capital was supposed to be protected by an impenetrable ring of defenses. Now American bombers had appeared over Tokyo itself, dropping bombs on the imperial capital in broad daylight. The emperor's own palace had been exposed to danger. The armed forces had lost face in the most humiliating way possible. Schools and civilian buildings had been hit, proving that Japan was not safe from American vengeance. For the Japanese public, the raid shattered the illusion of invincibility. For the Japanese military, it demanded a response. The operation that would become the Battle of Midway was accelerated partly to prevent future raids by extending Japan's defensive perimeter. The humiliation of the Doolittle raid drove Japanese strategic planning for months afterward. Yamamoto's letter to a colleague after the Doolittle raid captured his understanding of American psychology. He wrote that Britain and America might have underestimated Japan somewhat, but from their point of view it was like having one's hand bitten badly by a dog they were feeding. America, he said, was determined to embark on full-scale operations against Japan. He also noted that the mindless rejoicing at home in Japan over Pearl Harbor was deplorable. It made him fear that the first blow at Tokyo would make the Japanese public wilt on the spot. Yamamoto understood what his fellow leaders did not. The raid was not about the bombs. It was about American willpower. The Americans were coming, and they would not stop until they reached Tokyo itself. Of the 80 crew members who flew the raid, 3 were killed in crash landings or while parachuting. 8 were captured by the Japanese. 3 of those prisoners were executed by firing squad. 1 died of disease and mistreatment in prison. The remaining 4 survived over 3 years of solitary confinement and were liberated at the end of the war. The rest of the raiders reached China, either crash landing or bailing out when their fuel ran dry. Chinese civilians and soldiers helped many of them escape to safety, often at terrible cost. The Japanese army launched a retaliatory campaign across the Chinese provinces where the Americans had landed, killing an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in reprisal. Doolittle himself, convinced that the mission had failed because none of his aircraft could be recovered, expected to be court-martialed. Instead, he was promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. The raid that had caused so little physical damage had achieved something far more valuable. It had proven that Japan was vulnerable and that America was willing to take enormous risks to strike back. Almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese combined fleet steamed toward Midway Atoll with the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled. Admiral Yamamoto's plan was complex and ambitious. He would send a diversionary force to attack the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention northward. Meanwhile, the main striking force would approach Midway from the northwest. After carrier aircraft neutralized the island's defenses, an invasion force would land and capture the atoll. The real objective was not Midway itself, but the American carriers. Yamamoto believed that when America learned of the threat to Midway, positioned strategically between Hawaii and Japan, the remaining carriers would sortie to defend it. The powerful Japanese fleet would be waiting to destroy them. Yamamoto brought 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, crewed by Japan's most experienced pilots. He also deployed 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, including the massive Yamato, and dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and support ships. Against this armada, the Americans could muster only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier. Navy yard workers at Pearl Harbor, told they had 3 months to repair the ship, did it in 72 hours of round-the-clock work. America had no battleships available. The surviving vessels from Pearl Harbor were still under repair or serving in the Atlantic. The American force included only 8 cruisers and 18 destroyers. On paper, it should have been a Japanese victory. But American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to determine the target and timing of the operation. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team worked around the clock to analyze intercepted messages. They could not read everything, but they could read enough. A clever trick confirmed that Midway was the target. The codebreakers suspected that the Japanese designation AF referred to Midway, but they needed proof. They arranged for the base at Midway to broadcast an uncoded radio message reporting that their water purification system had broken down. Within 48 hours, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of water. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew that Midway was the objective, knew approximately when the attack would come, and positioned his carriers to ambush the ambushers at a location optimistically codenamed Point Luck. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft struck Midway while American dive bombers hunted for the Japanese carriers. After hours of confusion and failed attacks, everything changed in 5 minutes. At 10:25 that morning, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with their decks full of aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Within minutes, all 3 carriers were burning. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was found and destroyed that afternoon. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and over 300 aircraft. More importantly, Japan lost hundreds of its most experienced pilots, men who had spent years perfecting carrier operations and who could not be quickly replaced. The American losses were significant. The carrier, Yorktown, and a destroyer were sunk. Over 300 American sailors died. But the strategic outcome was clear. Yamamoto's prediction had come true. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's offensive capability was broken. The Imperial Navy would never again threaten Hawaii or the American mainland. From Midway forward, Japan would be fighting to defend what it had already conquered, and America's industrial machine was just beginning to produce. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was the first major offensive operation of the Pacific War, and the first test of whether American ground forces could match Japanese soldiers in sustained combat. The landings on August 7th caught the Japanese by surprise. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandergrift, quickly captured an airfield that the Japanese had been constructing. Within weeks, American engineers completed the runway and named it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed leading his squadron at Midway. For the next 6 months, the fighting never stopped. The Japanese could not accept the loss of Guadalcanal. The island sat astride the supply routes between America and Australia. If America held it, Japanese positions throughout the South Pacific would be threatened. The Imperial General Headquarters ordered the island retaken at any cost. Japanese forces attacked Henderson Field repeatedly, by land, by sea, and by air. The Marines and later Army soldiers fought off assault after assault. The names of the battles, Alligator Creek, Edson's Ridge, the Matanikau, Henderson Field, became legends in Marine Corps history. At sea, the fighting was equally savage. 7 major naval battles were fought in the waters around Guadalcanal. So many ships were sunk that the waters between Guadalcanal and Florida Island became known as Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese developed the Tokyo Express, high-speed destroyer runs that delivered troops and supplies under cover of darkness. American aircraft from Henderson Field made daytime operations suicidal, so the Japanese came at night. Both sides lost ships at a rate that neither could sustain. The jungle warfare was hellish. Malaria struck down thousands of men on both sides. Tropical diseases, dysentery, and infections from minor wounds killed nearly as many as enemy action. The heat was oppressive, the terrain was brutal, fresh water was scarce, supply lines were tenuous at best. Marines, who had expected a short campaign, found themselves locked in a death struggle that lasted month after month. They ate Japanese rations when their own ran out. They wore rotting uniforms and went weeks without adequate rest. They fought Japanese soldiers who had been taught that surrender was worse than death, and who attacked with a ferocity that American troops had never faced. But when the fighting ended in February 1943, Japan had suffered another defeat it could not afford. The Japanese lost over 14,000 killed in action, 9,000 to disease, and 1,000 captured. They lost 38 ships and over 600 aircraft. More critically, they lost the strategic initiative. Never again would Japanese forces attempt a major offensive in the Pacific. Perhaps as important as the military victory was the psychological one. On a level playing field, American ground forces had beaten Japan's best. The myth of Japanese invincibility on land, established in Malaya and the Philippines, was shattered, and the production disparity that Yamamoto had warned about was becoming impossible to ignore. While Japan and America fought at Guadalcanal, American factories were performing miracles of production that Japanese planners had believed impossible. When President Roosevelt called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, Hitler's advisors dismissed the numbers as propaganda. American military production in 1939 gave no indication that such targets could be achieved. The entire American military had fewer than 3,000 aircraft. The idea of producing 50,000 planes annually seemed like fantasy. But American industry transformed itself with a speed and scale that stunned the world. Before the war, American automobile manufacturers competed against each other to produce cars and trucks for civilian consumers. After Pearl Harbor, they converted to war production almost overnight. The Ford Motor Company, which had built automobiles at a rate of one every 69 seconds, transformed its operations entirely. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, designed by architect Albert Kahn and built at incredible speed, eventually produced B-24 Liberator bombers on assembly line principles that had never been applied to aircraft manufacturing. By the end of the war, Willow Run was producing bombers faster than any factory in the world, turning out one complete aircraft every 63 minutes. Shipyards expanded at similar rates. Gulf Shipbuilding in Alabama went from 240 employees at the start of 1940 to 11,600 by 1943. Alabama Dry Dock grew from 1,000 workers to nearly 30,000. Henry Kaiser's shipyards pioneered new construction techniques that reduced the time to build a Liberty ship from months to days. His workers could assemble a complete ship in under 2 weeks. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. By 1944, women made up over a third of the defense manufacturing workforce. They operated lathes and welding torches, assembled aircraft and ammunition, drove trucks, and operated cranes. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of American determination. The results were staggering. By 1943, American shipyards were launching more tonnage in a single year than Japan had produced in the entire war to that point. By autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced and exceeded. The German U-boat campaign that had threatened to strangle Britain was overwhelmed by sheer production volume. American factories produced almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment, including 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. By 1944, more than half of all industrial production in the world was taking place in the United States. In 1943, the United States manufactured nearly 30,000 tanks, more in a single year than Germany produced from 1939 to 1945. American factories built 100 million tons of war equipment over the course of the conflict. The disparity in carrier construction told the story most clearly. In the 3 years following Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. America built 17. But even this understates the advantage. American carriers were larger, carried more aircraft, and were supported by vast fleets of supply ships, tankers, and repair vessels that allowed them to operate thousands of miles from home ports for months at a time. The numbers told the story that Japanese leaders had refused to believe. They had gambled that democracy would prevent America from mobilizing its resources. They had assumed that labor disputes, political divisions, and public demands for consumer goods would prevent full conversion to war production. They were catastrophically wrong. American civilians accepted rationing of gasoline, rubber, sugar, coffee, meat, and dozens of other goods. They bought war bonds by the billions. They worked overtime without complaint. They sent their sons and daughters to war. The democracy that Japanese leaders had dismissed as soft proved capable of sacrifices that matched or exceeded those of any totalitarian state. As American production soared and Japanese forces retreated across the Pacific, Japanese pilots began reporting something disturbing. The Americans were fighting differently, not just with more ships and planes, but with greater skill and determination than Japanese doctrine had assumed possible. Japanese military training emphasized spiritual strength and warrior spirit as decisive factors in combat. They believed that American soldiers, raised in a soft, democratic society, would lack the willingness to close with the enemy and fight to the death. Instead, they found Marines who charged machine gun positions, pilots who pressed attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire, and sailors who fought burning ships until they sank beneath them. The Japanese had made a fundamental error. They had confused America's reluctance to enter the war with an inability to fight it. The isolationism of the 1930s was not cowardice. It was a democratic nation debating whether distant conflicts were worth American blood. Once that debate was settled by Pearl Harbor, America fought with exactly the fury that Yamamoto had predicted. The democracy that seemed divided and soft before December 7th became unified and ferocious after it. Japanese commanders discovered that American forces would not negotiate local surrenders, would not accept compromise peace terms, and would not stop until they had achieved total victory. The war that Japan had started with a surprise attack would end only with Japan's unconditional surrender. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, American P-38 fighters intercepted a transport aircraft over Bougainville Island. Aboard that aircraft was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the prophet who had predicted Japan's defeat, and the commander of the combined fleet. American codebreakers had intercepted and decoded his flight plans. A specially planned mission was launched to assassinate him. The P-38s shot down both bombers in Yamamoto's flight. The admiral's body was found the next day, still clutching his ceremonial sword. Yamamoto's death was a significant blow to Japanese morale. He was respected and admired throughout the Navy, one of the few leaders who commanded genuine loyalty rather than fearful obedience. His loss removed from Japanese councils the one voice that had consistently warned against underestimating America. But by April 1943, Yamamoto's warnings had already been proven correct. Japan was on the defensive across the Pacific. Its carrier force was crippled. Its best pilots were dead. The industrial tide that Yamamoto had predicted was beginning to drown Japan's military. The man who had understood America better than any Japanese leader, who had tried to warn his nation against a war he knew it could not win, died knowing that his worst predictions were coming true. Over the following 2 years, American forces island hopped across the Pacific, each campaign bringing them closer to Japan. The strategy was deliberate. Rather than assault every Japanese-held island, American commanders identified key positions that could be captured and used as bases for further advances. Islands that could not support air bases or anchorages were bypassed, their Japanese garrisons left to wither without supplies or purpose. The Gilbert Islands fell in November 1943. Tarawa, a tiny atoll with a garrison of nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers, cost the Marines over 1,000 killed and more than 2,000 wounded in just 76 hours of fighting. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated. Only 17 Japanese soldiers survived as prisoners. The intensity of Japanese resistance shocked American planners and the American public. The Marshall Islands followed in early 1944. Kwajalein and Eniwetok provided anchorages and airfields that brought American forces within striking distance of the Mariana Islands. The Marianas Campaign in the summer of 1944 was the decisive strategic blow. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam put American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. For the first time since the Doolittle raid, Japan faced the prospect of sustained aerial bombardment. The battle for Saipan lasted 3 weeks. Over 3,000 Americans were killed and more than 10,000 wounded. The Japanese lost nearly 30,000 soldiers, most of whom died rather than surrender. Hundreds of Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture and murder them, committed suicide by jumping off cliffs at the northern end of the island. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marines fought for 36 days to capture an island of 8 square miles. The Japanese had fortified the volcanic rock with tunnels, bunkers, and interconnected defensive positions that made every yard of advance a battle. Nearly 7,000 Americans died on Iwo Jima. Another 19,000 were wounded. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 soldiers was virtually annihilated. Only about 200 were captured as prisoners of war. The rest died, defending an island that had no strategic value except its airfields. At Okinawa, the fighting lasted almost 3 months and cost over 12,000 American lives. The Japanese deployed kamikaze aircraft in mass attacks for the first time, sinking or damaging dozens of American ships. The civilian population of Okinawa suffered terribly, caught between American bombardment and Japanese soldiers, who sometimes used them as shields or forced them to commit suicide. These casualties were precisely what Japanese strategy had counted on. The militarists had believed that if they made victory expensive enough, Americans would demand peace rather than continue the slaughter. Instead, each bloody victory only strengthened American resolve to finish the job. The sacrifices at Iwo Jima and Okinawa were justified by the promise that they were bringing final victory closer. Polls showed that American public support for the war remained overwhelming, even as casualty lists grew longer. By the summer of 1945, American B-29 bombers were reducing Japanese cities to ashes. The firebombing of Tokyo in March killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. The home islands that Japanese leaders had promised were invulnerable were burning, and still Japan fought on, even as its cities burned and its people starved, because the militarists who had started the war could not accept that they had lost it. The atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally brought Japan's surrender. But the outcome had been determined years earlier, in the fundamental miscalculation that led Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. Japanese leaders had believed that Americans were soft, that democracy made nations weak, and that industrial potential meant nothing without the spiritual will to use it. They had believed that a surprise attack would break American morale rather than unite it. They were wrong about everything. 16 million Americans served in uniform during World War II. American factories outproduced all other combatants combined. A nation that Japanese planners had dismissed as too divided and too comfortable to fight sustained the bloodiest conflict in human history until total victory was achieved. The miscalculation that led to Pearl Harbor was not merely military, it was cultural. Japanese leaders had looked at American society and seen only what they expected to see. They saw jazz, music, and Hollywood movies, and assumed decadence. They saw labor unions and political debates, and assumed weakness. They saw a nation reluctant to go to war, and assumed it was afraid to fight. They failed to understand that American reluctance to enter the war came not from weakness, but from democratic deliberation. And they failed to understand that once that deliberation was ended by Japanese bombs, America would fight with a determination that matched or exceeded anything Japan could muster. Admiral Yamamoto understood. He had lived in America, played poker with American officers, traveled across the American heartland. He knew that the image of soft, weak Americans was a dangerous illusion. But Yamamoto was overruled by men who had never set foot in the United States, who based their strategic assumptions on racial stereotypes and wishful thinking. They learned the truth only after it was too late to change course. The war that Japan started on December 7, 1941, ended on September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The ceremony took place on the deck of a ship named for an American state, under the guns that represented American industrial power, in the harbor of a Japanese capital that had been reduced to ashes. The symmetry was deliberate and devastating. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the surrender. Representatives of all the Allied powers stood behind him. The Japanese delegation, in formal morning coats and top hats, looked stiff and uncomfortable as they signed the documents that ended Japanese imperial ambitions forever. Among the flags displayed on the Missouri was the same flag that had flown over the Capitol building in Washington on December 7, 1941. Another flag present that day was the 31-star flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had carried when he opened Japan to Western trade in 1853. The message was clear. Japan's attempt to build an empire had ended where it began, with American ships in Tokyo Bay. Standing nearby in spirit was the Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor, where 1,177 American sailors remain entombed in the ship that carried them to their deaths on that Sunday morning when Japan's great miscalculation began. Those men died because Japanese leaders convinced themselves that their attack would break American will. Instead, it forged that will into something unbreakable. The cost of the miscalculation was staggering. Japan lost over 2 million military personnel killed in the war. Civilian deaths, from bombing, starvation, and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, brought the total to nearly 3 million. 66 Japanese cities were destroyed by American bombing. The once proud Japanese Navy was annihilated. The empire that had stretched across Asia and the Pacific was reduced to the 4 home islands. America paid its own price. Over 400,000 Americans died in World War II, including over 100,000 in the Pacific Theater. Millions more were wounded, physically and psychologically. The war cost the United States over $300 billion, a sum that would exceed $4 trillion in modern currency. But America emerged from the war as the most powerful nation on Earth, with an industrial capacity that dwarfed all competitors and a military that could project force anywhere on the globe. The country that Japan had dismissed as soft and decadent had proven itself capable of winning the greatest war in human history. The story of Japan's misjudgment is not simply a story about one war. It is a warning about the dangers of underestimating adversaries, of believing that other peoples are fundamentally different or inferior, of assuming that what looks like weakness is actually weakness. Admiral Yamamoto saw past these illusions because he had taken the time to know America, not as a target to be attacked, but as a nation of human beings with their own strengths and values. His warnings went unheeded because they contradicted what Japanese leaders wanted to believe. The consequences of that self-deception were measured in millions of lives, Japanese and American alike. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories that shaped our world. Each story matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans continents and generations, veterans and history enthusiasts, students and scholars. You are part of something important here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for helping keep these lessons alive.